In the winter of 1903, the city of Chicago built itself a palace, marble, mahogany, gold leaf 60 feet high, a grand staircase on either side of a foyer modeled on the great opera houses of Europe. It cost over $1 million, close to $40 million in today's money, and when it opened its doors, the newspapers called it the most beautiful theater in the world. And across the front of that building, in enormous letters, the owners put 4 words: absolutely fireproof. 5 weeks later, 602 people were dead inside it. Not 500, not 50, 602 in a single building, in a single afternoon. It is still, more than 120 years later, the deadliest building fire in the history of the United States. More people died in that theater than died in the Great Chicago Fire that made this city famous. And here is the part that nobody tells you. Here is the part that turns this from a tragedy into something much colder. Most of those people never touched the flames. The fire on that stage was put out in a few minutes. The building itself was still standing when it was overscorched. Gutted at the front, but standing. Firemen who ran inside expecting an inferno found something they were not prepared for, and grown men who had spent their careers pulling bodies out of burning buildings walked back out into the snow and sat down in the street and wept. So if it wasn't the fire, what killed 602 people in 15 minutes? The answer is inside that building. It was inside it the whole time, in plain sight, and every man who could have fixed it had already been told. And when it was over, and the city demanded someone pay for it, every single one of them walked away. This is the story of the Iroquois Theater. And it starts, like all of these stories start, with money. Chicago in 1903 was the fastest growing city on earth, and it was in a hurry. The Iroquois was designed to be the crown jewel of the theater district, a building so grand that people would come from across the country just to sit in it. Its owners had a deadline in their heads that had nothing to do with construction and everything to do with cash, the holiday season. The weeks between Christmas and New Year were the single most profitable stretch of the year for a theater. Miss it, and you're opening in the dead of a Chicago January into empty seats. So the Iroquois opened on the 23rd of November 1903. It was not finished. The ventilation system was incomplete. Some of the vents that were supposed to draw smoke up and out of the building had never been properly finished, and at least some of them had been sealed. The building had no fire alarm. Not a broken one. None. There was no way to call the fire department from inside the theater except to send a man out the door and down the street. There were no sprinklers anywhere in that building. And the fire equipment that was on hand backstage was not the standard water and hose you would expect. It was a handful of canisters of a dry powder compound, a product that had never been proven against the kind of fire that starts in stage scenery. There were inspections. There was a city building department, and there were inspectors who walked through this theater. And the theater opened anyway, in the months that followed the disaster. That question, how did this building pass, would produce a great deal of finger-pointing and almost no answers. But if you had walked into the Iroquois on that opening night, you would not have seen any of that. You would have seen the marble, you would have seen the gold, and you would have seen the sign in letters a foot tall that told you this building could not burn. Now let me put you in the room. The 30th of December 1903, a Wednesday. Cold, gray, the streets packed with snow. School is out for the holidays, and the show playing at the Iroquois is a musical comedy called Mr. Bluebeard, a spectacle, an enormous production, with actors dressed as animals, scenes set all over the world, and a ballerina who flew out over the audience on a wire. It was, above all, a show for children, and that is who came. Mothers brought their sons and daughters. Teachers brought entire groups of students, aunts, grandmothers, nurses with children in tow. It was a matinee 2 days after Christmas in a brand new palace, and every seat in the house had been sold. Every seat and then some. The Iroquois had 1,724 seats. On that afternoon, there were more people than that inside it. They were standing at the back. They were standing in the aisles. Estimates of the crowd run past 2,000. Take a second and picture the shape of that room, because the shape matters more than anything else in this story. Below, the main floor, the orchestra level, closest to the doors. Above that, a first balcony. And above that, climbing up under the ceiling, the gallery, the cheapest seats in the house, the ones filled with families who couldn't afford the floor. Hundreds of people, mostly women and children, sitting 3 levels up in the dark. Remember where they are. Remember how far they are from the street. The show began at 2 o'clock, and for about an hour it was wonderful. Then, during the second act, the orchestra started a number called The Pale Moonlight. The house lights dimmed. A double octet of performers came out to sing. Up above the stage, in the darkness among the rigging, was a bank of arc lights the fierce, sputtering electric lamps they used back then to throw a spotlight down onto a performer. One of them shorted out. A spark dropped from it and landed on a length of light muslin curtain hanging near the stage, the kind of fabric that goes up like paper. A stagehand saw it immediately. He reached up and beat at it with his hands, trying to smother it. He couldn't reach high enough. Somebody grabbed one of those powder canisters and threw the contents at it. And the flame went straight through the powder and kept climbing. Up it went, into the flies, the space above the stage where the scenery hangs. And that space was packed. Tons of painted canvas backdrops, ropes, and gauze, all of it hanging in a vertical shaft above the actors' heads, all of it bone dry. The audience saw the glow. Some of them saw the first flames. And nobody moved, because they had read the sign on the front of the building. Now the man on that stage. His name was Eddie Foy, and he was one of the most famous comedians in America. He was standing in the wings in a ridiculous costume, in full makeup, about to go on for a comic scene, and his own son was backstage with him that afternoon. Foy got his boy into the arms of a stagehand and told him to run. Then he did something that most men would not have done. He walked out onto the stage, alone with the fire climbing the scenery behind him in a clown costume in front of 2,000 people. Eddie Foy raised his hands and told that audience to stay calm. He told them there was no danger. He shouted at the orchestra to keep playing, and, incredibly, they did. Those musicians stood in the dark and played while the ceiling above them burned. Foy stayed there. He kept talking. He kept telling people to walk, not run, to walk to the exits. He stayed on that stage until the heat drove him off it, and when he finally moved, he shouted one more instruction into the wings, the instruction that everyone in that building had been waiting for. Lower the curtain. Because there was a curtain. Of course there was. This was the safety feature that the entire theory of that building rested on. Between the stage and the audience hung an enormous fireproof curtain, asbestos, they said, and its entire purpose was this exact moment. Drop it, and it seals the stage off from the auditorium like a wall. The fire stays where it started. The audience files out. Nobody dies. The stagehands pulled it. And that is where everything in this story turns. The curtain came down about 20 feet and stopped. It had caught on something. A light fixture, a wire, a projecting rod on the side of the proscenium accounts differ. And the men who might have known best were busy running for their lives. What is not in dispute is what everyone in that building saw. The great fireproof curtain of the Iroquois Theater hanging crooked, snagged, wedged, with a wide-open gap underneath it and a wall of fire building on the other side. Men grabbed it and hauled on it by hand. It would not move, and there is a colder detail still. In the investigations that followed, experts examined what that curtain was actually made of and concluded that even if it had come all the way down, it would not have saved them. It was not the solid asbestos barrier the public had been promised. In the words of one report, it was of no value in a fire. The most important safety device in the building was, in the end, a piece of theater. Now, backstage, the cast and crew were doing the only thing that made sense to them. They were running for the big double doors at the back of the stage, the freight doors. The ones wide enough to move scenery through, and they threw them open and went out into the alley. They had no way of knowing what they had just done. Fire is not really about flame. Fire is about air. That stage was a sealed shaft full of burning scenery, starving, with its vents unfinished and its ceiling holding the heat down like a lid. And those men had just opened a door at the bottom of it. The cold December air came in behind them in a rush. It hit that starving fire like a bellows. And every bit of superheated gas trapped in that stagehouse ignited at once and went the only direction it could go forward, out through the gap under that jammed curtain, into the auditorium. Survivors described a ball of fire. A sheet of flame that came out over the orchestra seats, rolled up along the gilded ceiling, and struck the balconies. It happened in seconds. It burned across the room above the heads of the people on the main floor and slammed into the 2 levels above them, the balcony, and the gallery, where those families were sitting 3 stories up in the dark. And now, at last, everybody in that theater ran. The people on the main floor mostly lived. That is a hard sentence, and it is the sentence that explains this entire disaster. They were close to the ground, close to the lobby, close to the doors, and enough of them got out. The dying happened above them. Because here is what those hundreds of people found when they came down out of the balcony and the gallery, in the dark, with fire above their heads. Iron gates. Across the stairways that led down from the upper levels, the Iroquois had accordion-style metal gates, the kind you pull across an opening and lock. Their purpose had nothing to do with safety. Their purpose was to make sure that anybody who bought a cheap gallery ticket could not sneak down into the expensive seats. They were there to protect the seating chart. And on the afternoon of December 30th, 1903, they were locked. Hundreds of women and children came down those stairs in the dark and ran into locked metal gates, and there was no way through. And behind them, the air itself was on fire. And that was not the only door that failed them. Elsewhere in that building, people who did reach an exit found doors that would not open. Some were locked, others were fitted with unfamiliar latch hardware, a European-style mechanism that a panicked crowd in a dark corridor had no idea how to work, and there was no one there to show them. Because that theater had never held a fire drill. The staff had not been trained. Ushers, in the accounts that survive, in some cases told people to sit down and stay in their seats. And in the places where the doors did open, they opened inward into a crowd pushing forward with the full weight of hundreds of people behind it. A door that opens towards you cannot be opened at all when a crowd is pressed against it. It becomes a wall. That is the answer to the question I asked you at the beginning. That is what killed 602 people in a fireproof building. Not the flames, the doors. Some of them did find a way out and found something almost worse. On the north side of the theater, fire escapes led out from the upper floors onto an alley, a narrow service lane called Couch Place. But the fire escape stairs were unfinished. In places there was a platform and then nothing beneath it, a drop of 2 or 3 stories onto stone. People went out onto those platforms because behind them was fire, and some of them went over the edge. Painters working on the building across the alley saw what was happening and pushed a plank out from their window to make a bridge, and people actually crossed it, high above the ground, in the smoke, and some of them made it. Some of them did not. By the end of that afternoon, the newspapers had already given that alley its name. They called it the Alley of Death. The fire department got there fast. They put the fire out fast. From the first spark to the last flame, the whole thing took about 15 minutes, and then they went inside. What they found in the upper galleries was not what fire does to a building. It was what panic does to human beings. The dead were stacked at the exits, layers deep, in the exact shape of the crowd that had been trying to get through a door that would not open. Firemen had to work at the piles for hours. Many of the 602 had not burned at all. They had been crushed or suffocated in the dark within a few feet of the street. The bodies were carried out into the snow and laid in rows. Downtown Chicago turned its stores and offices into makeshift morgues, Marshall Fields, restaurants, saloons. Parents walked those rows all night looking for their children. Of the dead, fewer than 100 could be identified that first night. Many of the rest were known only by a scrap of clothing, a shoe, a ring. New Year's Eve was 2 days away. The city canceled it. And then Chicago wanted somebody to answer for it. They started with a coroner's inquest, and then a grand jury, and the list of people indicted was long. The theater's owners and managers, the building commissioner, the fire inspector, even the mayor was pulled into the storm. The city's official investigation was blistering. It found the design inadequate, the exits inadequate, the equipment inadequate, the staff untrained, the inspections a failure. Everything the public had been told about that building was wrong. So how many men went to prison for the deadliest building fire in American history? None. The cases came apart, one after another, on technicalities and jurisdiction and the simple, ancient defense that has protected powerful men in every one of these stories. It was somebody else's responsibility. As the historian Nat Brandt put it, in the end, everybody was washing their hands of responsibility. There were civil settlements money paid quietly to some of the families without any admission of fault. And that was all. 602 people, 400 of whom would never see a courtroom verdict on their behalf, and not one criminal conviction. The men who put those words on the front of that building never paid for them. But the dead did leave something behind. And this is the part I want you to carry out of this video, because you have touched it literally. Physically touched it probably in the last week. Within weeks, Chicago shut down every theater in the city for inspection. Not one of them passed. And what happened next spread out from that alley across the entire country and then across the world. Theaters were forced to install real fire curtains, real alarms, real sprinklers. Vents were required, and required to work. Exit doors had to be marked with lights that stayed lit. Crowd capacity became a legal limit instead of a suggestion. And two of the changes are so ordinary now that you have never once thought about them. Public doors must open outward, not inward. Outward, so that a crowd pushing forward pushes the door open instead of sealing it shut. And in 1908, an engineer named Carl Prenzler, who had been scheduled to be in the audience at the Iroquois that day and did not go, put his mind to the problem of a door that has to lock from the outside but must always, always open from the inside. What he and his partner built was a horizontal bar across the door that opens the instant a body falls against it. You know exactly what I'm describing. It is on the door of every school, every cinema, every hospital, every shopping mall you have ever walked out of. We call it a panic bar. It exists because of a locked gate in a Chicago stairwell in 1903. There is no memorial on Randolph Street. A different theater stands on the site now, and the alley behind it is still there. You can walk down it. And most people who do have no idea what they're walking through. They were told the building could not burn. And it didn't, really. It stood there while 602 people died inside it, most of them within a few steps of a door that had been locked to protect the price of a ticket. This is Cindergrave, the stories the past tried to bury and hoped you'd never read. If you want more of them, subscribe, because it was always darker than they taught you.